the German side of me taught me that punctuality was very important. I'm sure I've mentioned this before. My grandfather was on his, he wasn't on hospice per se, but he probably would have been if under different circumstances. He had 3 different watches on his arm, to get the exact time to say, not to be late to say Shema. I don't remember what the other ones, but in other words, I respect your time is what I'm trying to say.
Well, punctuality rewards the punctual,
Here you go. All right. So our Parsha this coming week is Parsha Toldot. And it starts off basically kind of giving us a genealogy of Isaac, but immediately veers off to talk about how Rebecca, like her mother-in-law Sarah and like her daughter-in-law Rachel, was infertile. And so Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebecca conceived. Great. But an interesting point that a couple of the commentators notice is, unlike with, in the case of Abraham, for example, when Sarah can't have a kid, you don't see him get very involved. It's Sarah who comes and says, please take my maidservant and have a kid with her instead of me. And in the case of Jacob as well, there doesn't seem to be a ton of compassion from him towards his wife, who's struggling. But here we have a very clear example of Isaac not taking another wife or maidservant, and expressly praying for his wife. Incidentally, as you'll see later in the Talmud, there's a suggestion that it wasn't Rebecca who was barren. She wasn't the one with the infertility issues, it was him. Right, now that's a stretch if you take the literal reading of the text, but it's an interesting suggestion and might explain why he was more willing to pray for her and not go find another woman. Rebecca's experiencing a hard pregnancy and inquires of God basically what is wrong. The words she uses are interesting, and we'll talk about them later as well. She is informed that 2 nations are inside her and that one would dominate the other. Okay. Why would this answer ease her suffering? Right? She's suffering. There's something wrong, something going on, and being told that there's 2 nations inside of her and one's going to dominate the other. I don't see how that alleviates the suffering. Rabbi Buchwald, the founder of the organization National Jewish Outreach Project, who we've done some of their programs like the Shabbat Across America and Canada and the Hebrew Learning, in a Dvar Torah citing Rabbi Soloveitchik, explains the answer, explains that the answer didn't directly talk to what's going on with her, but it eased her suffering in the sense of it explained to her what her purpose was. It gave her life meaning. And in an age, well, that's a separate thing. All right. The Talmud suggests that it may have actually been, okay, I already said that. Rebecca, here we go. All right. And then the actual phrase that Rebecca uses when she cries out to God, Im kain lama ze anochi. It is usually translated as something like, if so, why do I exist? But Nachum Sarna notes in the JPS Torah commentary for Genesis, the Hebrew phrase is actually an incomplete sentence, literally meaning something like, if so, why then am or do I? She doesn't even finish her sentence. The phrase is dramatic and powerful in its incompleteness. One can almost imagine a twinge of severe pain doubling Rebecca over in mid-exclamation, as if to emphasize her distress. I thought that was a really powerful observation, because when you read it, it's hard. It is hard to make sense of what's being said there. It does feel like a mid sentence. So Rashi, on verse 20, chapter 25, verse 22, which it's a little later, but you'll see. So the next verse says that the twins within her, these roads. Hold on, let me get the exact text. There we go. But the children struggled in her womb. And she said, if so, why do I exist? Right? That's the common translation. She went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered her. So a lot of commentators take exception with this and either try to explain that she went to a prophet, or she went to the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, which is interesting. Did they really have yeshivas back then? As well as some commentators say, actually, yeah, the patriarchs and the matriarchs all had prophecy. And the Lord through a mediator answered her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. 1 people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. All right, so going back. So Rashi. It's the problem with making it so big. It's hard to get a whole lot on the screen at once. And they struggled. You must admit that this verse calls for a midrashic interpretation. Right? This is a famous expression of Rashi, darsheni. Interpret me. Since it leaves unexplained what this struggling was about, and it states that she exclaimed, if it be so, wherefore did I desire this? So this is a little bit of a different translation. She asked whether this was the normal course of childbearing. I'm not sure. I think this parentheses is somebody else adding it in, which is why it's probably in parentheses. So I'm just going to skip that for now. Our rabbis explained that the word vayitzrotzutsu has the meaning running, like rutz. Whenever she passed by the doors of the Torah, i.e. the school of Shem and Aver, Jacob moved convulsively in his efforts to come to birth. But whenever she passed by the gate of a pagan temple, Esav moved convulsively in his efforts to come to birth. Another explanation is they struggled with one another and quarreled as to how they should divide the 2 worlds as their inheritance. Okay. Tamar and Cain, and she said, if so, if the pain of pregnancy be so great Why is it that I longed and prayed to become pregnant? It's a very powerful Rashi and a very realistic one. You know, the other commentators are going off on this whole spiritual journey and really creating this whole narrative. And Rashi is like, and Rashi is known as the pshat, the more literal interpretation. He says, yes, there are those other explanations, but on a very simple level, she's saying, you know, I waited all this time for pregnancy, and if I only knew how hard and painful this was, I might not have been praying so hard. Okay. And now from the Eben Ezra, why did I desire this, or why am I so different? She asked experienced mothers whether what she was going through was normal, and was told that it was not. Right? And you know, sometimes when we're told that what we're going through is normal, that in itself can ease our suffering, you know, take us out of isolation. And so she was in pain, she was suffering, and then being told, actually, you know, the degree of your suffering or the kind of suffering is not normal. So now she's really concerned. The Talmud Yevamot. So this one I'm going to ask somebody to read just because it's a long one, and it speaks, part of it speaks directly to this and part of it goes a little bit on a tangent, but I think it's worth reading. Does somebody want to read a little bit? Shelley, you're muted. Still muted. Shelley, I don't hear you. No problem.
If a man married a woman and stayed with her for 10 years and she did not give birth, he is no longer permitted to neglect the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. Consequently, he must either divorce her and marry someone else or take another wife while still married to her. If he divorced her, she is permitted to marry another man. It is not necessarily of her account that she and her first husband did not have children, and the second husband is permitted to stay with her for 10 years. And if she had a miscarriage, he counts the 10 years from the time of the miscarriage. Gemara, the sages taught, if a man married a woman and stayed with her for 10 years and she did not give birth, he should divorce her and pay her marriage contract, because perhaps he did not merit to be built, that is, to have children from her. It is not certain that their failure to have children is due to her, as it is possible that they are not a suitable match for bearing children. Although there is no explicit proof for the matter, that one must take another wife if he had not had children after 10 years of marriage. There is an allusion to the matter, as the verse states, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar after Abram had dwelled 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to Abram, her husband, to be his wife. Incidentally, this verse also comes to teach you that years spent dwelling outside of Eretz Yisrael do not count as part of his tally. Consequently, if he was sick during this period, or she was sick, or if one of the two of them was imprisoned in jail, it does not count as part of his tally. Rava said to Rav Nachman, let us derive from Isaac that one may wait a longer period of time, as it is written, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife. And it is written with regard to the births of Jacob and Esau, and Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. This indicates that one may wait 20 years. Rav Nachman said to him, Isaac knew that he was infertile, and therefore there was no reason for him to marry another woman, as Rebekah was not the cause of their infertility. The Gemara responds, if so, Abraham should not have married another woman, as he was also infertile. Rather, the Tana requires that verse that states that when Jacob and Esau were born, for which Rabbi Bar Abba taught, this is because Rabbi He, Bar Abba, said that Rabbi Yochanan said, "Why were Ishmael's years counted in the Torah, as they do not appear to be relevant to its narrative, in order to determine through them the years of Jacob, that is, Jacob's age at the time that various events took place," as explained in the tractate Megillah. The verse concerning Jacob's birth was not meant to allude to a halacha about remaining married before having children, but to make it possible to determine Jacob's age by relating it to the age of Yismael. Rabbi Yitzchak told Isaac.
That's enough. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Right. So the main reason that I brought this was this line here that I mentioned, that I highlighted. Isaac knew that he was infertile. And again, based on a simple reading of the text, you would not conclude it. It says that she was barren. But she might have been barren because he was infertile. So I just thought that was an interesting thing, as well as basing halacha, right? This discussion is whether we have a rule that a person needs to either remarry, or when polygamy was acceptable, to take another wife after either 10 or 20 years, based on the experience of Abraham and Isaac. And this harkens back to what we talked about last week, the idea that the experience of the patriarchs and matriarchs are a lesson for us. Because otherwise, just because it was one person's experience doesn't mean that should be everybody's experience. It may just be accidental. That's what happened to them. All right. Any discussion on that before we continue?
No discussion, just a comment.
Sure.
It's the first time that I'm aware that the barrenness may not have been the woman's fault.
Right? I thought that was pretty progressive of them.
Yeah.
Rabbi, is this current halacha?
Not that I don't know of anybody that enforces this. I've never heard of somebody actually doing this. Ironically, now we can actually find out, not always, but often find out who, on whose part the infertility is. I learned that the hard way. When Dora and I had to get tested and all of that, and it wasn't fun. In our case, there wasn't a definitive explanation, but in many cases there is. And so the question then becomes, if the person actually knows for sure that it's not the man and the woman, should they, because of this mitzvah of having children, should they then go and marry somebody else? Because that's really the basis of the discussion. All right. Does somebody else want to jump in and read the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer?
Come.
Who's
reading?
Talk.
Yeah, Rabbi, it says, I'll read this.
Thank you. You got to listen to your wife,
You have to listen to me. He doesn't hear. That's why I have to tell him what to do.
Yehuda said Rebekah was barren for 20 years. After 20 years, Isaac took Rebekah and went with her to Mount Moriah, to the place where he had been bound, and he prayed on her behalf concerning the conception of the womb. And the Holy One, blessed be he, was entreated of him, as it is said, and Isaac entreated the Lord.
Thank you. So I thought this was interesting because it kind of extends the Akedah story to say that here, regardless of how traumatic it was for Isaac, you would think it was pretty traumatic seeing his father holding a knife over him. He, when it came down to this, he believed that this was the most appropriate place to get divine intervention, and so he went back there. Hold on. It continues. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Iz.
Yes.
The children were contending
With one
within one another within her womb like mighty warriors, as it is said, and the children struggled together within her. The time of her confinement came round, and her soul was nigh unto death owing to her pains. And she went to pray in the place whither she and Isaac had gone, as it is said. And she went to inquire of the Lord, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do? Jacob took hold of the heels of Esau to make him fall, as it is said. And after that came forth his brother, and his hand had held on Esau's heel. Hence thou mayest learn that the descendants of Esau will not fall until a remnant from Jacob will come and cut off the feet of the children of Esau from the mountains of Seir, as it is said. For as much as thou sawest that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, another scripture text says, vengeance is mine, and a recompense at the time of their foot shall slide. Pain can be physical, emotional, and existential. In Rebecca's expression of pain, there are alternative interpretations for what it was.
Thank you. That last paragraph is mine. That's not from the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. But the reason that I brought the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer is because this story, it starts off, according to many commentators, in the womb. This competition, this rivalry between Jacob and Esau, represents much more than just the two of them. They kind of become the archetype, if you will, for good and evil, for the learned versus the simple, and all kinds of other things. And ultimately, the idea being that the Jewish people are like Jacob, and whoever a particular enemy at the time is like Esau. And so at the times of the Talmud, the main enemy were the Romans. And so there was a lot of comparisons, the Romans and Esau. All right, so we read that already. Let's go to Or HaChaim. Somebody else want to read?
I will, it's Ruth.
Go for it, Ruth.
The children were quarreling inside her, etc. Both the expression, they quarreled, and the words, why am I there for, need examination. Rashi explains that if the pain involved in giving birth is so intense, why did I bother to pray to become pregnant? It is difficult to reconcile our image of the pious and righteous Rebecca with Rashi's comment. That is, she did not think the pain worth her while in order to become a mother. Also, if that had been her real concern, how did God's response alleviate her problem? Our rabbis have offered many and various explanations, none of which are acceptable as the plain meaning of the verse. The plain meaning of the word, can you read it for me? What is the word?
Vayitzrotzatsu. Vayitzrotzatsu.
Is based on the root ratzet, to crush.
Right. So Hebrew, like early Semitic languages, are based usually on three-letter root words. In this case, it's Resh Tzadik and final Tzadik. And he says, unlike what we saw before, where Rashi mentions, compare it to Ratz, to run, he says actually the root word is to crush.
Since there were two fetuses in her womb, she felt as if her womb was being crushed. She was afraid that she could not complete her pregnancy and would have a miscarriage as a result. Her question then was rhetorical. What good was my becoming pregnant if this pregnancy will not be completed successfully? The words, she went to ask God, meaning that she prayed to God to let her become complete her pregnancy without mishap. She felt that the miracle of her becoming pregnant after all these years surely should not be wasted by her not giving birth to a healthy child.
Thank you. So what I appreciate in this is that, all these commentators are men who haven't experienced pregnancy, who haven't experienced childbirth. And, it's much easier for men to kind of look beyond it for, greater or, other experiences. And I would imagine for a woman, it might feel a little dismissive, and so at least this commentator is really saying, hold on, let's stop for a second. What is the actual root word here? The word crush. It's a very, very vivid word that just says, that helps us understand just how painful we're talking about here. And then taking it to the next step and saying, and to the point where she was even afraid of a miscarriage, which I know is a lot of people's experience. Even if it doesn't happen, but the fear of it happening. Okay, next one from Bereshit Rabbah. Does somebody want to read this one? I figure it's a little more interactive. People read. Anybody want to jump in? All right, I'll read this one. Bereshit Rabbah. The children struggled, vayitrotzu, within her. Right, so this is the common translation, is not crushed, but that they struggled. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish disagreed. Right, does anybody remember who Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are and what their story is? So they were in-laws. They were brother-in-laws. And the story is about Reish Lakish being a gangster and a robber, and Rabbi Yochanan being the scholar. And one day Rabbi Yochanan was very beautiful, pleasant to look at. And one day Reish Lakish is wandering around looking for trouble, and he sees Rabbi Yochanan from the distance bathing in the water. And he thinks it's a woman. And so he does his best move to get her attention. And Rabbi Yochanan kind of jokes with him and says, I don't remember exactly, but if you used your strength and your troublemaking for the study of Torah, you would be a great scholar. To which Reish Lakish responded something about his looks, whatever, and ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan convinced Reish Lakish to change his ways, and he bribed him by saying, "My sister is just as attractive as I am. I'll marry you off to her if you come study." So it's an interesting backstory because they often disagree when it actually comes to things. So here's an example. So Rabbi Yochanan said, this one ran, ruts, right? So he's going with the, looking at the root as rotsetz, to run, instead of to crush, to kill that one, and that one ran to kill this one. Reish Lakish said, this one set aside the commandments of that one, and that one set aside the commandments of this one. I take that to mean that basically they saw the world differently. This one saw the world in a very Esau saw the world in a very practical way, and it was about survival and hunting and, all of that. And Jacob saw it from a spiritual perspective. Reb Rachia said, in the name of Rabbi Levi, so that it might not be said that once he emerged from his mother's innards, he joined in battle with him. But rather, while he was in his mother's innards, his fist was aimed against him. Hence the verse, the wicked are estranged from the womb. Interestingly, a lot of people have looked to this text in the great debate of nature versus nurture, right? Because it seems, at least from those that interpret it as they were basically already struggling based on their personalities in the womb, that it's nature, that before they even came out, they already had their destinies, or at least their inclinations in a certain direction. In other words, they weren't the tabula rasa, the blank sheet. And I think I brought some text about that later. If not, I can go back to it. Anyway. His children struggled within her. At the time when she stood near the synagogue and the study house, Yaakov kicked, hence the verse, before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. And when she passed the house of idolatry, we already said this, Esav ran and kicked to emerge. And were there synagogues and houses of study in those days? And there was no halacha save in the study of Shem and Aver, right? Shem was the son of Noah, and Aver was, I think, Shem's grandson, and they're credited for being righteous. But rather, this comes to teach you that anyone who pays respect to the elderly is as if one paid respect to the divine presence. Right, and this is based on...
excuse me, Rabbi, I don't get that transition.
Yeah, it's not clear. What I think it's going on that's not said is that when it says that she prayed to God and God answered her, for those that interpret it that it wasn't actually prophecy, that she was going to the school of Shem and Aver or something like that, and yet it doesn't say that. It says she went to God. It's as if you go to your elders, it's as if you went to God. All right, Talmud, some more Gemara. Right, the words Talmud and Gemara are often used for the same thing, to mean the same thing. Does somebody want to read?
I can read.
Thank you, Sandy.
You're welcome. The Gemara explains, from where do we derive that Esau did not rebel in Abraham's lifetime? As it is written, and Jacob was cooking a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was faint. And a Bereta? What's that?
Braita.
What does that mean?
A Braita is kind of like a shadow Mishnah, if you will.
Oh.
So we have the Mishnah, and then there's this whole other text from around the same time, often with similar topics and things that discuss. And so they're often quoted.
I never heard the term before. Okay, on that day, Abraham, our forefather, passed away, and Jacob, our forefather, prepared a lentil stew to comfort Isaac, his father, as it was customary to serve mourners lentil stew. The Gemara explains, and what is different about lentils, that they in particular are the fare customarily offered to mourners. They say in the West, Eretz Yisrael, in the name of Rabbi Bar Mari, just as this lentil has no mouth, i.e. it does not have a crack like other legumes, so too a mourner has no mouth. That is, his anguish prevents him from speaking. Alternatively, just as this lentil is completely round, so too mourning comes around to the inhabitants of the world. The Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between the two explanations? The Gemara answers, there is a practical difference between them with regard to whether it is appropriate to console a mourner with eggs, which have no openings, but are not completely round. Rabbi Yochanan says that wicked Esau committed 5 transgressions on that day that Abraham died. He engaged in sexual intercourse with a betrothed maiden. He killed a person. He denied the principle of God's existence. He denied resurrection of the dead, and he despised the birthright. And that was in one day.
Yeah, he had quite the rap sheet.
Yeah. Wow.
So I brought this one in, because I thought it was interesting. People often are interested in the rituals around death and dying and mourning. And a lot of people still have this tradition to have lentils in the first meal after the burial, as well as eggs or other round things. And this is the origin of where that comes from. And, I don't look at lentils, that closely to notice whether it has a mouth or not. I think of black-eyed peas, right? They're called eye because it has like a little thing, which you can call an eye or a mouth. But it's derived from our parsha here. So that was the reason that I brought that. But now let's go to Samson Raphael Hirsch. I found this in a Dvar Torah. I brought the link for it earlier. Our sages never objected to draw attention to the small and great mistakes and weaknesses in the history of our great forefathers. And this is a fascinating I don't know what the right word is. But, and people, I'm sure you've heard it before. It's, if I was creating a foundation myth of a people, I would want to paint the founders as in the best light possible. If these are going to be our examples, right? And in this case, our forefather, not just in the Torah, but the sages as well, often really pick apart the forefathers, which makes it feel more authentic and more relatable. Anyway, and thereby make them just the more instructive for us. Here too on the verse, when the boys grew up. So this is a later verse, but it still speaks to our parsha. Make a remark, which is indeed a signpost for all of us. They point out that the striking contrast in the grandchildren of Abraham may have been due not so much the difference in their temperaments as to mistakes in the way that they were brought up. Says so basically, I understand this to mean, going back to the nature-nurture debate, that even if they had different temperaments in the womb, they still could have turned out very differently. Says Rabbi Hirsch, to try to bring a Jacob and an Esau up in the same college, make them have the same habits and hobbies, want to teach and educate them in the same way for some studious, sedate, meditative life is the surest way to court disaster. It's a pretty powerful, number one, a pretty powerful way of saying it, and also a pretty powerful idea. I think about it, the yeshiva that I went to, the teachers were often, pretty bright, but they didn't have a whole lot of training and education. And the only qualification was, did they know the material well? And so, the kids that had the most focus, and the most self-motivation did well. And there was basically one career track to become a rabbi or a shliach or whatever it was. And for a lot of, for the rest of the kids, they were often lost to a certain degree. And, it's easy to blame temperament, but Rabbi Hirsch is saying here that regardless of what temperament people bring in, we need to follow what it says in Mishlei, in Proverbs, train a lad in the way he ought to go. Chanach lanar al pi darko. He will not swerve from it even in old age. So that's what I've got here. Any questions or comments?
Well, just Shelley, just a defense of the yeshiva way of teaching. That's all. I mean, I think whether or not you're going to be a rabbi, a foundation in the thinking methods of the Talmud is invaluable.
I agree. I was speaking specifically about my yeshiva. I think, and now I think some of them are starting to get it a little bit more, that they actually need training and education, and that it needs to be a little bit more individualized.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that I went to growing up, there was none of that.
Well, I went to a more modern yeshiva where, Hebrew was taught in the morning and English subjects in the afternoon, and both were equally valued. So that's different from Chaim Berlin or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, my comment is to me, the difference between how this is interpreted and the four sons in the Haggadah. Because the four sons seems to me a more realistic depiction of children and parents, that children are not blank slates when they're born. We know that now. And it seemed that identifying your sons or your children as different personalities who need different approaches, which is what those questions say, is very different from what you hear here, that just train them. There's one thing about, and I agree with Shelley, that you give children a foundation, but they're very different from the get-go. And I think that's the story of Esau as well.
Right. And how you give them that foundation.
Right.
Right. So there's the material that's being taught, and then it's how it's taught. Is it taught visually or just, orally? Is it...
Right. We've come a long way from identifying barriers to learning as we do now, and what method would work best. So you can't blame the ancients on that. But I think they did recognize, whether, even though it's not explicitly stated here, how different children are.
Yeah. Yeah.
That hasn't changed.
And I think, that's the... you see that with Isaac and Ishmael, and then you have, that same dynamic in the next generation. So clearly there is that message from the get-go.
Right. I think it's wishful thinking that if, you teach children a certain way, they're all going to learn it. But
right.
Intuitively, we know that's not true.
Yeah. All right. So that's Parsha Toldot. Bernard, do you want to say something?
I was just going to say, a little off the topic, the nature nurture topic. I like the comment. I found it interesting about our forefathers being imperfect, and it struck a chord in me with recent conversations we've had the last few months and I don't want to tread on anyone's toes, but with current events about taking down statues and recognizing that our country's forefathers were imperfect, that they were slave owners, they had their own mishigas and stuff. So I found that an interesting correlation.
Yeah, yeah. And it is a struggle, right? We don't want to idealize too much, imperfect people too much, because then it says it's okay to do whatever you want. right? The flip side is if we completely tear them down, whether figuratively or literally, we run the risk of learning anything from the past, right? Because everybody's flawed, and so it's there's a line to be drawn. The only question is where, and that's really the debate.
Rabbi, hi, it's Jack. I have just a thought that I just realized, like both Esau or I think Cain, there was something negative about doing physical or hunting. And I don't know how much this permeated where that sort of outside of, you can say, the total Jewish experience of that level. I mean, yes, there were Jewish farmers and Jewish hunters, but basically not really. And I don't know if that's significant or just, I'm not sure, but it just sort of seems to be there.
You're right. It's definitely there. And I think, continuing on the kind of the current events theme, it's a major issue both here in the United States and in Israel, where there's so much emphasis put on Torah study of certain circles, and not doing, other practical labor, that you have a lot of people who are dependent, because they don't have a lot of other skills, and it's it gets tricky. But you're right. It is, when describing Esav, it talks about him being a hunter and these things, and it kind of, at least it seems to be painting it that these things are negative, and sitting and studying is the right thing and the better thing.
That's definitely the message that comes through.
Yeah.
I think it wasn't until the rebirth of Israel that they started giving credit and recognizing the value of working the land and being the hunter, so to speak, on an equal level as being the scholar.
Right. But they made the exception for some scholars, and by making that exception without capping it, without saying, you know what, we can subsidize 600 scholars or whatever it is. Now you have hundreds of thousands.
Right, and it does speak to possibly political power, which made that happen.
Yeah.
I just read a novel called Kin and Country about Israel in its 100th anniversary in 2048, when the ultra-Orthodox, because of their high birth rate, get to be about 50% of the country. And the novel is about, well, should the state of Israel split into two different countries, one that's religiously oriented, centered around Jerusalem, and one that's secular, centered around Tel Aviv. It's an interesting novel.
That's very interesting.
And without divine intervention, the Jerusalem one would fold immediately.
Yes, well, and they want to make a arrangement with Iran to protect them.
Ah.
Well, just another comment on what I said before. I'm almost tempted to take it back, because the struggle that continues in Israel, and based on what you're saying, Shelley, will continue to be, does go back to the struggle of Esau and Jacob in the womb. So maybe it's as relevant today as it was then.
Yeah.
We have our own struggles in America with two potential countries. So I don't think we have to go to Israel to look at issues by 2048 or whenever.
True.
So we have
we have our own divisions.
We have our own divisions that are quite real, actually.
Yeah.
And without taking sides either or, they're real. And who knows if they're reconcilable? But you never know. Goodness and virtue, I'm going to
country, just Staten Island. Should it stay part of New York City, right?
Yes.
There you go.
So can you extrapolate then and say that the struggles of Esau and Jacob really are applicable to all societies and not just Jewish?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
An interesting question, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Why don't we leave it at that?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, absolutely. Tomorrow night services at 7:30. They're not
Right.
too long. So if you're free, please join us. And then Friday night at 6:30.
And anyone interested in working with Ruth and Corey on Ways and Means, please, there's a virtual meeting on Tuesday evening.
Yeah.
7:30, Ruth, right?
Yes. Where's Dan? Danny, are you taking care of that?
Dan?
Dan?
Am I hanging up?
Okay, thank you.
What are you shushing?
And Rob, is this your last joining us from Staten Island? Did I catch that right?
I'm here until December 17th.
I caught that wrong. Got it. All right. Well, it's good to have you.
Thank you.
It is
You
good
too.
to have you.
Mhm.
Hey, everybody.
All right, guys. Take
Talk
care.
tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You got it. Bye.